Swifter, are you Doctor Who? Because you're about to lord over time with your impending Swifty knowledge of time zones and custom date format patterns. By the time this video is over, you will be able to detect how a date should be displayed based on that date's time zone. For example, at the same moment on a Tuesday in Boston, it might be a Wednesday in Sydney. So you're going to learn to work with Unix format dates, the time interval type alias. You'll create time zones using the TimeZone identifier standard, you'll add time zones to a date formatter, and you'll create a custom date format pattern. It's time for big learning. Now we're going to update our app, replacing what we currently have there, which is the time zone of the weather location, with the date and time, and specifically in this format, which is not one of the standard Apple formats. We're going to be listing the full day of the week, the abbreviated month, the date, and the time. Now, we'll eventually get rid of the time, but we want to keep it in there just to illustrate that we are getting the proper time at the various locations. For example, this isn't the current location. Like it says here, we'll eventually get the current location. Temporarily, that's just coordinate 2020 someplace in Chad. And at the time that I'm recording this, that's Monday at 8:35 p.m. Now, if we swipe to Gonzaga in the U.S. Pacific time zone, that time is 12:40 p.m. At Georgia Tech, it's 3:40. At San Francisco State, it's back at 12:40. At Boston College, it's 3:40. In Ouagadougou, it's 7:36 p.m. And in Sydney, it's tomorrow. So the previous ones were Monday. In Sydney, it's Tuesday at 6:36 p.m. Let's figure out how we can update this. So I just showed you what the app is going to look like when we're done with this video. Now I've returned to the app in its current condition, and we'll code it up. If you've already got some JSON up in a browser, that's great. But I close my browser, but I'll have the app generate a new URL. And remember, we print out the URL in weather detail, so I'm just going to open up Boston College since I want to see the weather where I am, and then I'm going to grab the URL down here from the console, highlight the complete URL, copy it with a Command-C, paste it into the browser, and I see the weather right now in Boston. Now the time we want is inside of the current key, and it has the key DT. And what the heck is this? It doesn't look like a time or a date. This must be some kind of mistake, right? Well, actually, it is a valid time, but it's in a format that only a computer would want. The OpenWeather API, and many other APIs for that matter, use date in what's called the Unix time format. Sometimes it's called POSIX time, sometimes it's called epoch time, and this time is calculated as the number of seconds that has elapsed since midnight, January 1st, 1970, not counting leap seconds. Yuck! Not friendly at all. And this is decidedly different from Apple's date format, which is calculated as the number of seconds that have elapsed since the third millennia started, which is midnight, January 1st, 2001. Now, if we print a date in Apple's date format, it will print the date and time in a bit friendlier format, but behind the scenes, this is how it's calculated. But fear not, intrepid programmer. There's a fairly easy way for us to convert from Unix time to a valid Apple date. And remember, Apple dates also include a time. Now, all we need to do is to create a date instance using the type name date, but also use this constructor that includes this time interval since 1970 parameter. So let's learn a little bit more about how we can work with dates in a playground. So first, let's return to our JSON output that we have in our browser, highlight and copy this number that's the value for the DT key under current. Then let's get back into Xcode. We'll create a new playground, file, new playground. Mine will be blank. I'll save it to the desktop. I'll call it dates and times. I'll expand the window, get rid of the default string, and we'll begin using the date that I copied by saying let Unix date equals, and I'll paste in the value I copied. Now, if we option click on Unix date, we can see that this is an int, and that's not really what we want. We want to declare this as a time interval. So I'm going to type in colon and then time interval, upper camel case. This is an Apple type. Well, look at code completion. It's actually not quite a type. It actually says that the type here is a double, and it is a double. Time interval is what we call a type alias. So it's a bit more helpful for the developer to refer to this as something that's got a time inside of it instead of a straight up double. But behind the scenes, what's really happening is a time interval is a double. We could have put double right in here, but it's nice to have time interval show up and remind us, oh yeah, this is a time. It's sort of like if your given name is Jennifer, but we call you Jen. Both are the same thing. Now in the next line, let's convert this to Apple's date format. So we'll create a new constant with let usable date equals capital date, open parens, and we see there are a bunch of different options for creating a date. Let's select this one here that says time interval since 1970. This is specifically here to convert from Unix, POSIX, epoch time into an Apple date format. Press return on that, and we'll pass in Unix date. Then let's print out the usable date. And our console output is 2020-05-28-1831. The plus 0000 is Greenwich Mean Time, meaning the hours are plus 0 or no time different than Greenwich Mean Time. Well, that's definitely better than 1590-69-07-10. But it's still not great. We want to use a date formatter to get this in the time zone in the format that we want. And we worked with date formatters in the to-do list app, so we're going to do pretty much the same thing here. We'll create a date formatter by saying let date formatter equals upper camel case date formatter, and we'll just open and close the parens to create a blank date formatter first, but we'll configure it down below. So remember, we can set a date style and a time style. So on the next line, I'll type in lower camel case date formatter dot date style equals dot medium. And under that, I'll say date formatter dot time style equals dot medium. And now we'll eventually take the date and convert it to a string so that we can display it in the text property of our date label. So let's convert the usable date to a string right now. So we'll say var date string equals date formatter dot string, and code completion shows us that we pass in a valid Apple date type with a capital D. So press return to accept this, and if we option click back on usable date, we can confirm, yes, it is an Apple date type with a capital D date. So let's pass in usable date here. And then on the next line, let's just print date string, shift return. And we see that it's formatted using the time zone on my computer. So that's US East Coast time. If you're performing this exercise in something other than US East Coast time zone, you probably see something that's different from 4 hours before the time at plus 000, which is Greenwich Mean Time. But hopefully you're seeing the time calculated according to the time zone as it's set on your Mac. Now, since I'm in Boston, checking the weather at Boston College, you can see that the time in the upper right of my Mac is just a few minutes past when I copied and pasted it from the web, and I accessed my API. So that's to be expected because I'm in Boston and I'm checking the weather in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, same time zone. But things would be different if I looked at the weather data in a different time zone. So feel free to follow along here. I'm going to return to my app. I'm going to look for the weather in Sydney, Australia, the other side of the world from where I am. I'm going to copy the URL that my app prints out in the console. I'm going to paste this into a browser tab. Then I'm going to go and grab the value for DT, that's a date time, which is Unix time under current here, and I'll return to my playground. Then I'll comment out this first time here. I'll identify it as Boston time, just in case you want to go back and look at that. And then I'll put under here a comment that says this is going to be Sydney time. Although really, as you'll see, they're both based on Greenwich Mean Time, so the one is just a few minutes after the other. I'll paste it in. Let me copy the variable declaration code up above and just paste it in front of that Sydney Unix time. And if I shift and return down below, I can see it's at 2:37 p.m. Now, this is the time in Boston. And to be clear, the time interval that we have is based on Greenwich Mean Time. The reason why we're seeing it in Boston is because output is taking a look at the time zone that's set in the preferences on my Mac. If I want to get the time in Sydney, I need to somehow tell the date formatter that I want to convert the time zone not using the preferences setting in my Mac, but using a time zone for Sydney. Now, there are a few ways to do this. One is to create a time zone object. In the way that a date is a date and time, well, time zone represents a time zone. And you can create these in a few different ways. You could use abbreviations. We're going to use the official identifier string. That's actually what's returned by the time zone key in our API. Now, there's actually an international standard with specific spellings for all of the time zones in the world. And as long as we use a string with this official international time zone identifier standard, we can create a time zone object inside of our app. If you're curious what the time zones are, we can actually print them out. So let's see. Why don't we enter into our playground down here the time zone type name. So that's time zone in upper camel case, then dot. Then if you start to type in known with a K in here, you'll see one of the options is known time zone identifiers. And code completion says this returns an array of strings listing all of the time zones known to this system. Cool. Press return to accept this and surround this with a print statement and then press shift return. And wow, down below we see that there are a lot of time zones. Now, there should only be 24 hourly time zones in the world for 24 hours in the day cycle. It varies a little bit because there are some quirks in the time zone system. There are a few oddball time zones that are set off by 30 or even 45 minutes, but there's nowhere near as many as you see down here in the console. Now, the reason for that is there are identifiers for several large cities that are in the same time zone. For example, Montreal, Canada and New York are both in the same East Coast time zone in North America, but Montreal is French, it's a Canadian city, they shouldn't have to use New York, so you can refer to either America Montreal or America New York, that'll both give you the same time zone. By the way, if you want to print out the time zones as a list instead of one big clustered array value, you can put this in a for loop, or just to quickly review functional programming with for each, you could say time zone, upper camel case, that's the type, dot known time zone identifiers, dot for each. And remember, for each acts as a for loop. And then in the body, we can type in curly's print parens $0. And that $0 acts as an element in the array as it goes through all of the elements in the array. So that'll print out everything. And you don't need to do that, but I thought it was a nice quick review for functional programming in the middle of our date exercise. Now, probably more practical, if you wanted to look through a list to find a particular time zone, you could just look for the Wikipedia page for the list of TZ database time zones. And you can scroll through and see that there's a complete list. This column that says TZ database name is the value for the time zone identifier. And we can trust the output that comes through time zone. We don't have to verify anything. We can just use whatever the service gives us. But now you know how to look up codes, either by getting a list in your app or by checking a reference online. So I'm going to highlight Australia/Sydney, copy it, return to my playground, and create a time zone value for this time zone. First, I'm going to comment out this line where I print out all my known identifiers. And then just below that, I'll enter let time zone, lower camel case, I'm creating a constant, equals upper camel case time zone, that's the type. And when I open parens, I see lots of different ways I can construct something of a time zone type. So one option is with identifier that accepts a string. I'm going to highlight and press return on this one. And then in between quotes, I'm going to paste in the Australia/Sydney. Then I can add the time zone property, this constant that I just created, to my date formatter. So on this line, I'll say date formatter, lower camel case, that's the date formatter I created, dot time zone, lower camel case. This is the time zone property of a date formatter, the first time we're using that. And we'll say that equals, again, lower camel case time zone, but this is the constant we just created above, the Australia-Sydney time zone. Then I'm going to go up here and I'm going to copy from my date string in the print line below it. So I'm going to reuse that. I'm not going to highlight var, but I'll highlight these two lines and copy them with a Command-C, paste this down below, and then I'm going to put in 3 statements just to identify the output so that we can see which line is which in the console. So right here above my first print statement, that's after I declare my usable date constant, I'll put in print, and in quotes, GMT for Greenwich Mean Time. And then I'm going to go down to just above where I should print out the Boston time zone. And I'll put in another identifying print statement that says, my time zone, Boston, taken from my Mac. And then just above this last print statement, I'll put in another print statement, but this one will say Australia/Sydney. And now when I shift return, I see my output. All 3 of these are taken from the same Unix date, converted to a usable date. So the first value is GMT, it's unformatted. The time is 1837, which is 6:37 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and that's 2:37 p.m. here in Boston, and in Sydney, it's tomorrow at 4:37 a.m. Move over, Doctor Who, you are now a Time Lord. Now, if we wanted to format with one of the standard Apple date styles, then we'd be good to go. But I'll put in a comment down here with an example of the kind of format that I originally wanted. So that was full weekday name plus abbreviated month name plus day and year. So currently we have .medium and we don't see weekday. And I'll just change the .date styles for the date formatter here and rerun the output so that you can see the changes. And .long gives us the full month name and no weekday, and we wanted the abbreviated month. Of course, I'm running this in May, and there's no abbreviation for May anyway. And if we change the date style to .full, we get the full weekday, but we see too much of everything else. So what if we do if these iOS date styles don't work for us? Well, it's possible to create a date format pattern for custom date and time formatting. And in the way that there are standards for time zone strings, there are also standards that are used for formatting date patterns that lots of different programming languages and even different technology products use. So let's check out these patterns. So down here I have the pattern that I need to use in order to get the format that I want. And in a window up top, I'm going to show you where you can find the official date format patterns in case you want to create your own patterns at some point in the future. So to find the pattern reference, just search for Date Format Pattern Unicode. Unicode is the official standard setting body for these things, and if you find the unicode.org page, it's a pretty long page, but if you search for Date Field Symbol Table, you'll see this table that shows example patterns and how they're used. So I want this one here that's got 4 capital E's for the full weekday. Anything not in a pattern is considered to be a spacer. So the fact that I've got a comma and a space afterward will put a comma and space after the weekday in my date pattern. Then 3 capital M's give me an abbreviated month. A single lowercase d gives me a date without any leading zeros. And a single lowercase y gives me a year without any leading zeros. Now there's a date format property of a date formatter. It's ignored unless it has a value, but if it does, then it'll be used instead of date style or time style. So we can set this on our date formatter by typing in dateformatter.dateformat, and there's no description in code completion, but we see that it takes a string. So we'll say equals, and then we'll type our format string, which is 4 capital E's, comma, space, 3 capital M's, space, lowercase d. Then I'll highlight these 3 lines here, the one where I set my date string through the second print. I'll paste them after I set my new date format string, and I'll just change this first print statement so that it says Australia/Sydney with date pattern. And if I do a shift enter, I see the full weekday, that's the 4 capital E's, and I see the abbreviated month, although you can't tell because it's May, that's MMM, and I see the date, which is the lowercase d. Nice! Now, if we had to take a look at our code in weatherdetail.swift, we're already getting DT inside of current, so that's our date time. We're already getting a time zone, that's inside of the result level. We've also got the 2 class properties that are going to hold those values, so time zone and current time, those are all set up. And down here in our do catch clause, we're taking result.timezone and putting it in self.timezone and result.current.dt, and we're putting it into current time. So we're all set. So now we can head over to Location Detail View Controller, and we'll use the same technique to create a date formatter that we used in our earlier to-do list app. We'll just change the styles inside and replace them with our date format pattern string. So right underneath our import statement and before our Location Detail View Controller class definition, we'll say private let lower camel case date formatter colon upper camel case date formatter, that's the type that we're about to create, equals, and then open and close curlies. And I'll put in this print statement that says, I just created a date formatter with a calendar emoji in front. And so we don't need this in here, but remember, creating a date formatter is an expensive process. So we put this in just to prove to ourselves that we've only created one date formatter if we look down on the console and we only see that calendar emoji showing up once. So inside here, we'll say let date formatter equal capital date formatter, open and close curlies. That creates a blank date formatter. And below that, we'll say return date formatter to return the date formatter. And we only need one line to configure the date formatter, and we can actually reuse what we created in the playground. So if we hop back to the playground, we highlight this line right here that's got our date format pattern string, copy it with Command-C, return to our weather location detail view controller, paste it in. Whoops, we've got to have an open and close parenthesis right after this last curly here. That'll execute this closure, which acts like a little function that sets up our date formatter. And we've just configured our date formatter. Now we still need to set up our time zone, but we're going to have to do that when we configure our user interface. Inside Update User Interface, after we get our weather detail data, inside our main thread, we'll set the date formatter's time zone property equal to, and we'll say capital time zone, open parens, and we want to select the configuration option that has the identifier parameter, and we're passing in a string. So press return. Now I'll copy weatherdetail.timezone from the line below and paste that in as the identifier. So now our date formatter has a time zone. And now on the line below, let's create a usable Apple date. So we'll say let usable date equals capital date, open parens, select the option time interval since 1970, since that's a Unix date, and that's what we're getting back from Dark Sky. So we'll pass in here weatherdetail.currenttime. And now that we've got this set up, we can just change self.datelabel.text equals to, and we'll pass in date formatter dot string, so the date formatter creates a string, and select the option from, and the date we're going to pass in is usable date. And Xcode is grumping because I forgot to put selfs in front of the weather detail, so we'll just allow Xcode to fix those. Now in our final app, we're not going to put hours and minutes in our date label, but let's add hours and minutes to our date label right now, just so that we can see what's happening with the time from time zone to time zone. And the only thing we need to do to make that happen is we can scroll up to the top here to our dateformatter.dateformat string, and to the end of this, I'll add comma, space, lowercase h, colon, 2 lowercase m's, and a space, and 3 lowercase a's. That'll give us an hour, a minute, and an AM and a PM. Now we'll eventually go back and delete the time portion of this custom date formatter, but we want to double check to see how the time is formatting from time zone to time zone. So go ahead and build and run. And we can see at the first location, someplace in Chad, it's Thursday at 9:46 p.m. Swipe to Gonzaga in Washington State, and it's 1:46 p.m. there. Swipe Georgia Tech, it's 4:46 p.m. Swipe in San Francisco, it's 1:46 p.m. Same as Gonzaga. Swipe again. Boston College is 4:46, same as Georgia Tech. Swipe again. Ouagadougou at 4:46 p.m. But if we swipe one more, let's see what's going on with Sydney. And hey, it's tomorrow at 6:46 a.m. Better buy me a lottery ticket, Sydney. Tell me how things are going to work out tonight. Swifter, you've gone worldwide with your skills. So congratulations, Swifty Time Traveler. You have now mastered several advanced concepts related to using dates, including working with time zones and custom date format patterns. Nice work. Keep at it.